Okay, we've started recording and now I'll just go quickly through tonight's agenda. We'll go over some housekeeping and then we'll introduce you to the Cumulative Impacts team. And then at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. If you do come up with questions throughout the show, you can use the QA feature at any time during the presentation, but we will do answers at the end. So the purpose of this meeting is to promote a shared understanding of agency data, forms, processes, and decisions. This is an opportunity for members of the community to ask their questions directly to subject matter experts from the agency. The questions and comments that we discuss tonight do not constitute formal public comments or complaints to be entered into record. So subject matter experts, we want this to be interactive as much as we can. We have received some questions before the webinar, which they will be answering during the presentation. With that, I'm excited to introduce to you our Cumulative Impacts team. These will be our presenters tonight. And if you want to follow along, the QR code on the left, you can use your smartphone to download the full Cumulative Impacts report. And if you use the QR code on the right, this will take you to our website where we have all of the rules that will be discussed this evening. And with that, I'll pass it on to Sabrina.
Great. Thanks, John. Can everybody hear me okay? I see some nodding. Okay, good. Well, good evening, everybody. Some of you probably already know me and might be tired of hearing me talk. My name is Sabrina Trask, and I'm the manager of ECMC's Cumulative Impacts and Energy Transition Unit. I want to extend my gratitude to everyone that's logged on tonight. I'm deeply appreciative that you've chosen to spend some time learning about what the Cumulative Impacts team does at ECMC and the work that we do. Tonight, some of my team members and I would like to present a very brief overview of ECMC's Cumulative Impacts program, including a little bit about what cumulative impacts are, how we evaluate and address them, and how you can participate and be informed about cumulative impacts in your community. We'll spend the bulk of tonight's presentation sharing with you some highlights of our recently published 2025 report on cumulative impacts. So just a quick overview of the CIET unit. This is the Cumulative Impacts and Energy Transition Work Unit within ECMC, CIET for short. We're housed in the operations section of ECMC under the Deputy Director of Operations, Greg Duranlo. This work unit is made up of two distinct but overlapping teams. The Cumulative Impacts, or CI team, highlighted here in yellow, and the Energy Transition, or ET team, highlighted here in green. The ET, Energy Transition team, works to enable and prioritize Colorado's transition away from oil and gas and into other clean energy and other emerging technologies. We're not going to have time tonight to talk at length about the work that the ET team is doing, but if you'll indulge me just for a moment, I'd like to take a moment to share some exciting updates on some of the Energy Transition team's programs. So our deep geothermal program, we've just received our very first deep geothermal permit application from an operator about a week ago. This permit application was submitted to us pursuant to our new 1300 series geothermal rules. And we're really excited to be working through this first of its kind permit in the state of Colorado. If that permit is approved and successful, this particular project will use the Earth's natural heat from deep underground to create electricity with zero emissions. It's an exciting first step in Colorado's statewide Heat Beneath Our Feet initiative to develop this clean energy source. Next, I want to give a quick overview of ECMC's Class 6 program. Carbon capture and storage, or CCS for short, is a new industry gaining traction around the world as a tool to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere. In CCS, CO2, which is a greenhouse gas, is captured during manufacturing and other industrial processes rather than letting it escape as pollution into the atmosphere. That captured CO2 or carbon dioxide is then injected deep into the earth through an underground injection control well, or a UIC Class 6 well, where that CO2 will remain in perpetuity. These Class 6 CO2 injection wells are only authorized by the federal EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and are highly regulated to ensure the protection of underground sources of drinking water. In 2023, with the passing of Senate Bill 23016, ECMC was granted authority to regulate Class 6 wells in Colorado. In order to do this, we need the EPA to grant us primary enforcement authority, or primacy, to regulate Class 6 wells on the EPA's behalf in the state of Colorado. So the Energy Transition Team submitted Colorado's application for primacy to the EPA last October. And we've been meeting with EPA's Region 8 team regularly on the status of our application. Currently, our application is in the final phase of EPA's process. Our application was deemed complete earlier this year, and the public comment period closed on May 4th. The EPA's administrator signed the new proposed federal rule to approve Colorado's application for primacy, and we are just now awaiting the final granting of that primacy to the state of Colorado. If granted, Colorado will be the 7th state in the nation to have primacy of Class 6 wells. The Energy Transition Team is preparing to give ECMC's commission an update on both our deep geothermal programs and our Class 6 program on July 1st. That is one of the commission's sort of regular Wednesday morning hearings. I will invite all of you to attend that virtual presentation if you are interested and able. The information for that will be posted on ECMC's web page, just like it always is. So that was a lot. Tonight, now I want to pivot to the cumulative impacts side of the CIET unit. The cumulative impacts team's primary focus is to reduce the adverse cumulative impacts of energy development while driving ECMC and the state of Colorado to achieve our mission and our climate goals. We do this primarily through conducting a thorough cumulative impacts review and assessment of every oil and gas development plan permit application. And you'll hear us through tonight's presentation refer to an OGDP. That stands for Oil and Gas Development Plan. That is the primary permitting mechanism for oil and gas at ECMC. We also oversee operators' proper plugging and reclamation of old end-of-life wells through our marginal well plugging program. And this team also supports local and tribal governments in their efforts to advance renewable energy in those jurisdictions, including the development of wind, solar, and battery energy storage systems, or BESS. I do want to note that although we do provide technical support in renewable energy, ECMC does not regulate wind, solar, or BESS projects. We act sort of as a consultant to any counties and municipalities who permit those types of projects through their own authority. So with that, I'd like to take a moment to have each person on my team introduce themselves, but since we've got a few folks missing tonight, I'll start with Dita since she's not here. Dita Osborne is our Senior Air Quality Specialist. She oversees ECMC's state and federal marginal well plugging programs. She also contributes to multiple commission and other agency and academic, technical, and policy working groups. And she's the main bridge to our partners at CDPHE's Air Pollution Control Division. with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to introduce the rest of the team.
Thank you, Sabrina. Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephen Schwarz. I am the Cumulative Impacts Supervisor here at the agency. I have had multiple roles from the permitting unit to the location assessment unit, dabbling a little bit with our hearings unit as well. And it's my extreme pleasure to oversee a team of 4 fantastic specialists here within the Cumulative Impacts team. I'm going to start with some introductions of the folks who won't be speaking tonight, and then I'll hand it off to my colleagues who will be speaking. Starting with my colleagues Alex Axe and Mike Wells. Alex is our science and technical writer, but they do more than just what you would think in that title. They focus on science research, technical writing, desktop publishing, website updates, and collaborating with other scientists inside and outside of the agency to contribute to the work the unit does. Mike Wells is our cumulative impacts data specialist. He manages the mountain of data that we have coming in to the agency from all of our OGDP projects and all the cumulative impacts data that comes in. This is collected, organized, and put out for presentation in the annual report, as well as our future under construction in the works website dashboard, which we anticipate having up before the end of the year. Now I will turn it over alphabetically to my 2 colleagues who are here with me tonight. Pete, please take it away.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. My name again is Pete Dunleavy. I'm the Renewable Energy Program Coordinator with ECMC. I've been in this role for about 18 months now, and it really is a pretty interesting and dynamic space, working across the state to assist local and tribal governments on solar, wind, and battery storage projects. And I'll touch just a little bit more on that later in the presentation. But with that, I'll turn it over to Daniel. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Pete. Good evening, everyone. Glad you could join us tonight. My name is Dan Sharon. I'm the ECMC Cumulative Impacts and Emissions Specialist. My work at ECMC focuses on the review of emissions and cumulative impacts information from permit applications primarily. And I've been with the agency for about a year now. Yeah, and excited to share more of our work with you later in this presentation.
Thanks, team. We're really excited to hear your presentation. But before we get started, we'd like to do an audience poll to get an understanding of everyone's familiarity with cumulative impacts. So you'll see a poll come up on the Zoom module now, and we'll take about 60 to 90 seconds to allow you to answer this, and then we'll share the results in real time. All right. Well, thank you everyone for participating. It looks exactly like the report, and with, as you can see, there's multiple categories that we focus on. There's not just one impact. That's why they call them cumulative impacts. So now I'll turn it back to Sabrina, and we'll start the show. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And thanks everybody for taking that little survey. I'm going to be really transparent. I can see the list of attendees in here, and I recognize a lot of names. We've got some stakeholders watching tonight who have been long-term stakeholders and partners with ECMC. So I just appreciate everybody joining us, and I appreciate that so many of you, at least given the names on the list here, already have a good idea about what ECMC does around cumulative impacts. So for those who are new to cumulative impacts, I'm going to take a little bit of a step back. One place to start is with the statutory definition. So this was defined in Colorado law. Cumulative impacts are, I'm not going to read the whole thing, you can read it, but as a background, ECMC was given the statutory mandate to evaluate and address cumulative impacts. This happened with the passing of Senate Bill 19181 back in 2019. So it's been over 5 years now. Since we implemented our historic mission change rulemaking in early 2021, there have been at least 3 subsequent bills that have expanded our mission to evaluate and address cumulative impacts and given us this statutory definition that you see on the screen here. So when we look at the definition in the law, cumulative impacts are defined as the effects on public health, including air quality, water quality, climate, which is vague, but also defined in statute, noise, odor, wildlife, and biological resources caused by the incremental impacts of any proposed new operation, so a new OGDP. We also have to consider past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future development. That's a lot to take into, and especially those impacts that are in or near a disproportionately impacted community. So that's a lot of sort of legal and legislative jargon. What does this mean in our day-to-day work? So in our practice, in order to define or determine the cumulative impacts of a new proposal, we first need to understand what are impacts generally. Specifically, we want to know what are the sources of impacts, what are the impacts themselves, and what are the human, animal, and environmental receptors that may be affected by those impacts. Per ECMC rules and practice, we want to identify and understand sources of emissions and air pollution, the quality of surface water and groundwater, the availability of water as a resource to people, wildlife, and industry. We want to understand noise, odor, light, dust, and traffic. These are sort of collectively known as the nuisance issues. We want to understand where people live, work, and play, and the status of the community's general health and welfare. We want to understand where land use disturbances are and what those disturbances look like for wildlife and high priority habitat. We want to understand what biological and soil resources are present, such as plants, birds, fish, animals, reptiles, amphibians, and other non-wildlife species. And we want to understand what beneficial impacts are considered, such as community benefit agreements, the plugging of old wells, or the cleanup and remediation of old oil and gas locations. We also want to understand impacts over time. It's not just a snapshot. This includes identifying past impacts that an environment or community has experienced, such as a closed coal mine or a reclaimed landfill, or previous documented chemical spills. Present impacts include things that are currently in existence, things that we can see on the ground or measure in the air, such as active landfills, power plants, cattle or feedlot operations, auto body and paint shops, even sports arenas. While sports arenas might not seem harmful, we do know that facilities, not bagging on Topgolf, but facilities like Topgolf centers can be a really significant source of light pollution at night. Car and motorcycle racing tracks as well can be significant sources of noise and dust pollution on race days. Future impacts are those that are known to occur in the future or largely anticipated. So when we say known, we mean that there's an approved permit or something that we can point to in the public sphere that clearly indicates an impact is likely to occur. These are things such as a platted subdivision, areas rezoned for future schools, planned future reservoirs, or even other approved oil and gas projects that haven't been built yet. So cumulative impacts, once we know what we're looking for, becomes kind of a simple math problem of adding all the impacts together. The past impacts plus the present impacts plus the future impacts plus the impacts associated with the new proposed OGDP, all those together equal cumulative impacts. So how does staff evaluate this? This is a lot of information to take in. We do this in two ways. In the long term, we do this through the annual cumulative impacts report, which we'll get into a little bit later in this presentation. In the short term, we do this through the OGDP permitting process. We conduct a cumulative impact review of every OGDP application that gets submitted to us. For each new proposed project, we assess the proposed location, the operations being proposed, how many wells, how many tanks, are they going to frack or not? We assess the adverse impacts that we can reasonably anticipate from the project, and also any beneficial impacts that the operator might commit to. We ask questions like, what are the impacts? How are they likely to happen? How long will they occur for? When will they occur? And how intense will they be? We also ask who or what will be impacted, and what will that impact look like or feel like to that receptor, that human or that water body or that wildlife that might experience those impacts. What will it mean to the health and well-being of the person, animal, or resource that will be affected? So in order to do this type of evaluation, we need information, we need data. These data are gathered through two different but powerful tools that this team has in our toolbox, the Form 2B and the Cumulative Impacts Analysis. So the Form 2B, those of you that have looked at a Form 2B know how robust it is. It's a lot of data crammed into one electronic form at ECMC. The Form 2B is a data collection tool in which operators or applicants define, quantify if they can, and estimate the impacts associated with their proposed new operations. This form is required as part of every application for new oil and gas locations and is thoroughly reviewed by Dan on our call here, our CI and emissions specialist, as well as by one of the location assessment specialists from our planning and permitting unit. Much of the information, some of the information on the Form 2B is associated with information submitted by operators on the Form 2A, which is the location assessment. Our colleagues, Ben Frizzell and Rebecca Treats, provided an overview of the OGDP permitting process in, I think, last month's informational community meeting. If you click this QR code on the screen now, it is a link to take you to that presentation about what is the OGDP permitting process. So thanks to Ben and Rebecca for sort of laying the foundation for that. The Form 2B also includes data fields for all the different types of impacts as described in ECMC Rule 315A. So if you're following along or looking in the rules, you'll want to open the 300 series rules and scroll down to find Rule 315A, which is near the bottom of the 300 series, near the end of the 300 series. So this includes estimates for various emissions, such as NOx, VOCs, methane, CO2, and particulate matter, both for pre-production operations like pad construction, drilling, and completions, and also for 1 year of full production. Because so much of the data provided in the form are estimates, and because ECMC doesn't regulate emissions and cannot set a limit to how much pollution an operator can emit, the Form 2B is recognized by the Commission as a data collection tool rather than a permit decision-making tool. Certainly, our commissioners use the information in the Form 2B to inform their permit decisions, but we largely treat this as a data gathering tool. We also work very closely with the Air Pollution Control Division. You'll hear us use the acronym APCD tonight. That's in the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, or CDPHE. So we work very closely with APCD to align the information that we gather in the Form 2B with how APCD regulates emissions through their permitting process and their annual reporting requirements. The information submitted through this form goes into our cumulative impacts and data evaluation repository. That's a mouthful. We just call it CIDR. It's a database. It's part of our regular COGIS database, or Colorado Oil and Gas Information System database. This data then becomes the basis of information for the annual cumulative impacts report. At the end of tonight's presentation, we'll show you how to access the Form 2Bs on our website. You can also, as I mentioned, you can click the QR code here to see the permitting program. And we also have links at the end of the slides tonight to show you how to access some other information on our website. So these, again, are estimates, planned impacts or anticipated impacts determined during the permitting review process. These are not impacts that have occurred on the ground largely. We'll talk a little bit more about sort of the estimates that we discover or that we describe in the cumulative impacts report, and how we incorporate or compare the estimates to the actual reported data later. Just keep in mind that the Form 2B is estimates of impacts. They're not real impacts that have occurred yet. The second tool, or the other tool that we use, is the cumulative impacts analysis. This CI analysis is required as part of every new location permit application in the OGDP process and contains extensive maps and narrative descriptions on both the existing conditions on the ground and the proposed project impacts. This, if you want to know the sort of the rule requirements specifics, you're going to want to look at Rule 315B. In the CI analysis, operators define an area of evaluation around their proposed new location. The rule describes a default of a 1 mile radius, but operators can either contract or expand that radius, and staff can also recommend contraction or usually expansion of that radius for the area of evaluation. Operators then provide a detailed narrative describing all of the past, present, and future sources of impacts within that area of evaluation and all the potential receptors of those impacts. This analysis is reviewed by multiple ECMC staff members to ensure that what the operator is proposing, what they've identified as impacts, what they've identified as receptors, and how they've described the scope, the scale, the likelihood, and the probable outcomes of those impacts is in alignment with staff's expectations based on our own internal review. If an operator presents information that doesn't fit with what ECMC staff might expect for a given location or a proposed operation, the CI analysis is returned to draft or returned to the operator during the permitting process so that they can make corrections or clarifications as needed. Once corrected, staff reviews it again to ensure the reworked permit application meets all the ECMC rules and requirements. In contrast to the Form 2B, that is primarily a data collection tool, the cumulative impacts analysis is a permitting tool because it is attached to the Form 2A location assessment. This is an enforceable permit that, if it's approved by the commission, the operator must comply with. That said, it's still important to remember that even though the CI analysis is part of the Form 2A permit itself, ECMC cannot hold operators to any emissions or water use limits or estimates described in the analysis because we don't have the legal authority to regulate emissions or water use. Where the CI analysis does become enforceable is in the operator's description of how they will avoid, minimize, and mitigate those impacts through best management practices, or BMPs. We'll talk a little bit more about BMPs in a moment. I just wanted to show you an example of an area of evaluation. And so, excuse me, there's three map views shown on this slide. This is for a proposed location from a few months ago. I don't know the status of this OGDP application at this time. But in the leftmost map view, you can see a small sort of pink outline of where the proposed location is. And then there's a radius, roughly a 1 mile radius drawn around that location. That radius, inside that radius, there's a bunch of sort of colored odd shapes. Those are soil types that could be impacted within 1 mile of the proposed location. So we look at what are those soil types? Are they permeable? Are they porous? If there is a spill on that location, where would the fluid go to? Where would it run off to? Would it absorb into those soils, or would it just sheet off those soils until it hit a different soil? These are some of the things that we analyze in the cumulative impacts analysis. The second map there shows surface waters within that 1 mile radius. These are surface waters that could be impacted. Actually, my bad. The center picture, I forgot. The radius for surface waters is actually a default of 2.5 miles, and this is because we know that surface water moves. So that center picture shows a 2.5 mile radius around the proposed location. You can see sort of on the northern portion of that location, there is a significant river of likely a floodplain or a floodway. So these are how we look at and understand and identify potential impacts to surface waters as well as groundwaters. And then finally, the third map, the map on the right, we're going to go back to the 1 mile radius. The third map shows some potential beneficial impacts of this proposed project. In this case, the existing wells within a mile, some of those have been identified for plugging as part of this proposed project. So there's 4 sort of small red dots. Those are old end-of-life wells that, as part of this OGDP application, the operator has committed to plugging those wells as part of this project. So just a very sort of quick sampling of some of the desktop review that this team does in the cumulative impacts analysis. So as I mentioned, as part of the CI analysis, operators are required to describe how they will avoid, minimize, and mitigate adverse impacts related to their proposed operations. This framework is what we call the mitigation hierarchy, and it is truly a central focus of ECMC's regulatory and compliance processes. So using the mitigation hierarchy, we start by looking for operators to avoid impacts. That's always the best case. Avoid the impacts altogether. This can be done in a couple different ways. First, by avoiding receptors. So siting new well pads far away from homes, outside of DI communities, away from high priority habitats. But another way to avoid impacts, which is probably even better, is by avoiding creating those impacts in the first place, regardless of where they are. Those impacts that cannot be avoided must be minimized, usually through the use of BMPs, or best management practices, such as emission control devices, sound walls, and placing timing limitations on certain operations, such as prohibiting work near a bald eagle nest during nesting season. We rely on our partners at Colorado Parks and Wildlife, or CPW, largely for for almost all of the wildlife related BMPs. And then those impacts that cannot be avoided and cannot be further minimized must be mitigated. This can be thought of as an offset. The impact is still there, but something else is applied to compensate for it. This usually looks like some type of beneficial impact, such as compensatory mitigation fees paid to CPW for the disturbance of wildlife habitat, the plugging of old wells, or the implementation of local community benefit agreements. So as you can imagine, the Form 2B is a very complex form with a tremendous number of data fields, and the cumulative impacts analysis is a dense, 40 to 80 page document filled with a lot of maps and technical language and tables and charts. In order to make this information easier to access and easier to understand, our rules require plain language summaries of both of these documents to be included in every OGDP application. These plain language summaries are simpler versions of the same technical information condensed down into a more easily digestible format for readers. The two plain language summaries are submitted by operators as part of their OGDP applications as standalone documents. The cumulative impacts analysis plain language summary is found with the rest of the Form 2A attachments on the Form 2A. And the Form 2B plain language summary is found with the Form 2B attachments. We're going to provide links at the end of today's slides to help you navigate how to find these plain language summaries. So in the future, we are also planning to host these plain language summary documents in a standalone part of ECMC's website for easier access. That is currently in development. I hope it happens sooner rather than later, but in the meantime, we're going to give you some tips and tools how you can access those. That was a lot. I'm going to stop talking now and hand the mic over to Stephen.
Thank you, Sabrina. So as Sabrina has gone over, we now know what cumulative impacts are, how we address them here at the agency, how we evaluate them. And now we're going to pivot a little bit to discussing our annual report. This is published every May, and the report discusses trends that we're seeing in the data, not only from the past year, so calendar year 2025, but also compares last year with the years we've collected before. And again, as a reminder, this comparison, looking at the estimates, comparing them to the actuals, is very helpful. However, the estimates are not always definitive. The value comes from comparing these over time. The estimates being submitted during the permitting period up front compared to the actuals that are submitted on forms to ourselves and APCD after the work has actually been conducted. And we understand that numbers may change. Field conditions can sometimes differ from plans. For example, one of the changes we highlight in the report is a few instances where an operator had proposed, for example, a diesel drilling rig for their drilling phase, but through working with the public utilities, we're actually able to use lower polluting electric drilling rigs. This then changes what the actual emissions are down the road with that electric rig versus the diesel that was originally proposed. This report helps us to identify those differences and understand them, not only in a given year, but through time. So, getting in a little bit of how the report's constructed. The Cumulative Impacts Report splits Colorado up into 6 different operating areas based primarily on the operating style within each area and follows simple county boundaries. This allows for every project application to always have a defined operating area. So looking into 2025. In 2025, there were 48 OGDPs, or 48 projects, consisting of 81 locations. These were approved across all Colorado, all of the major operating areas, with the majority of them being approved in the Front Range operating area, which is mainly between Denver and the Wyoming border. The West Slope, on the western half of the state, saw the next highest count of projects approved, followed by the Eastern Plains, off on the eastern side of the state, and then the Southeast. And finally, the Southwest and North Park operating areas each had a single project approved, within 2025. Now, moving from approved plan projects towards looking at existing wells in the state, in 2025, we saw more wells plugged, so a total of over 1,000 wells plugged, then were either approved through new OGDPs, so that's 801, or were that began drilling from previous approved projects, 775. The Front Range had the most wells plugged, helping push the statewide total wells to a net 608 more wells plugged than started drilling in 2025. And so that's a really important takeaway, is that even though we're approving new locations and new wells, we are plugging them between our orphan well program and the operator's actions. More wells are being plugged than are being approved in 2025. So now I'm going to hand it off to my teammate Dan, who's going to start us off in the first operating area, the Front Range. Take it away, Dan.
Thanks, Stephen. We're going to, as Stephen said, we're going to begin our 2025 overview of operating area highlights with the most active oil and gas basin in the state, which is the Front Range. The Front Range has by far the most OGDPs, locations, and wells approved in any given year, and 2025 was certainly no exception. In the past year, we did see an overall reduction in emissions compared with 2024. This is the result of fewer OGDPs, locations, and wells being approved in 2025 compared with 2024. And so while overall emissions did go down, we've found that pre-production emissions of certain air pollutants actually increased on a per well basis in 2025 in the Front Range. These pollutants include carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, methane, volatile organic compounds, and formaldehyde. These pollutants are largely products of combustion of hydrocarbon fuels, and the main sources of that during the pre-production phase are from large engines used to drill and complete wells. So these increases indicate to us that emissions reductions attributable to the adoption of cleaner technologies in the Front Range, such as electric drilling rigs and tankless or tank light facilities, are potentially being offset or outpaced by operational and or siting challenges, such as longer horizontal laterals, which require longer completion times and thus more engine supplied power and more emissions. At this point in time, completions fleets are primarily powered by Tier 4 diesel engines, and there isn't really a viable pathway for electrification there. I do want to draw a red line here. I know Sabrina mentioned this earlier, but though ECMC does gather emissions estimates that feed into our cumulative impacts database and inform our analysis in our annual report, we do not regulate air pollution emissions or air quality. That is the agency that does that is the Air Pollution Control Division of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. We do work closely with APCD on data sharing, including permitting data and inspection data, which helps inform both agencies on what types of equipment works well to reduce emissions, ensures operators are in compliance, especially in the ozone non-attainment area. And actually in this year's report, we did a comparison between estimated emissions as reported on the Form 2B with actual emissions that operators are required to report to APCD, just to make sure that the data that we're collecting is accurate, as I saw a question kind of related to that pop up in the chat or in the Q&A. All right, some other Front Range highlights. In 2025, we examined proposed versus actual drill rig types for the Front Range. And through a review of OGDP materials, rig reports, and communications with operators, we found that when an operator specifies a certain rig type in their OGDP, they will generally end up using that specified drill rig type when they move to the operations phase, or they will switch to one with a lower emissions engine or even grid power if it's available. So that's a positive trend there. As I think most folks know, the Front Range is also the most densely populated operating area and consistently has locations that are sited within 2,000 feet of one or more residential building units in any given year. This number did decline overall in 2025, again, likely in part due to the reduction in the number of locations approved compared with 2024. So when a location is sited within 2,000 feet from an RBU, there are certain Rule 604B off-ramps that allow operators to do that. And some of those ways include receiving informed consent from all affected owners and tenants. Another way is when a location has received preliminary siting approval as part of a comprehensive area plan or a comprehensive drilling plan. Operators can site permanent production equipment greater than 2,000 feet from the RBUs, or they can show that through implementing best management practices or other conditions of approval, that they've provided substantially equivalent protections to residents. So as shown in this figure on the right, you can see the green bars, that 604B1, that's the receiving informed consent from all affected owners and tenants. That is the most, by far the most utilized off-ramp over the past 5 years and was the most used in 2025. Okay, for the last highlights for the Front Range, want to talk about water usage. So the Front Range uses by far the most water of all operating areas, both overall and on a per well basis. You can see in this the pie chart in the upper left, that dark blue chunk of the pie, that is the Front Range. Everything else is obscured pretty well by the Front Range water usage. This is largely driven by the reason operations in the Front Range use so much water. It's largely driven by the increasingly longer horizontal well bores, typical of this operating area, which requires about 400,000 barrels of water on average for each well completion. I did want to provide some kind of bulk numbers here when we talk about cumulative impacts in our report. We're interested in what are the totals, what's the total impact from all of the OGDPs that were approved in a given year. So for 2025, the freshwater usage just for the Front Range was 300 million barrels or 12.6 billion gallons of freshwater. We do focus on freshwater because 91% of the water used to complete wells comes from freshwater sources, typically surface water or groundwater sources. And so the other part of that can be a combination of other sources. And in recent years, we've stepped up efforts to increase the usage of recycled produced water in pre-production operations. However, we've been seeing a continuing decline in the percentage of recycled produced water utilization year over year. And the percentage of statewide estimated recycled water use reached an all-time low of 5.2% in 2025, driven largely by a number of Front Range OGDPs, which planned on using no recycled water. That said, in 2025, we did compare proposed recycled water usage versus actual recycled water usage and found that on an average per well basis, Front Range operators are actually using more recycled water than they planned. So slight positive end to that. And now I'll pass it back to Stephen, and he'll give us some West Slope highlights.
Thank you, Dan. So the West Slope operating area saw the second most projects approved in 2025. And one of the biggest takeaways from the West Slope data in 2025 is how changing development styles can lead to changing impacts, particularly a shift we are seeing from directional well development to more horizontal well development. Now, I don't expect everyone on this call to be a drilling engineer. So let me go into a little explanation of what is meant by directional versus horizontal drilling. So what I have here are two cartoons of typical examples of what a directional and horizontal well is. On the left, I have a typical west slope directional well, and on the right, a typical front range horizontal well. As you can see with the directional well, it's called directional well because it changes direction instead of being straight down vertical wells, which is the more classic traditional method. This leads to a well being a little more complicated to drill than a straight normal vertical well, in that they have to drill down, move over, and then continue on down. Even with this slight change in direction, these wells typically don't take too long to drill. And because only a small section of the well is in the target zone, in this cartoon, the dark brown layer, these do use some water, but in the west slope, it is typically recycled water that they're using. Now compare that to the horizontal example on the right-hand side. These are more complicated because you have to drill straight down, then turn 90 degrees to be horizontal, and then keep drilling horizontal for 2, 3, 4, even more than 4 miles to stay within that dark brown target zone. Because of how long these wells are, they naturally take longer to drill. And because more of the well is in that target zone, it takes a significant amount of water to complete the well or connect the formation so that the oil can flow into the well itself. So now that you have a little bit of background between the difference of directional wells and horizontal wells, let's talk some more about the changes of the impacts that we're seeing in the West Slope in 2025 by having more of these horizontal wells. So in 2025, we saw a notable increase in emissions, proposed estimated emissions, as more of these horizontal projects were being approved. One example is here on the left, where there is a marked increase in the estimated amount of hazardous air pollutants that would be emitted from these 2025 projects. Additionally, on the right, we see a change in the water use per well over time, growing in the West Slope from that more directional well, lower water use style in 2021 and 2022, growing to a more horizontal well water use style by 2025, more similar to the well per well water uses that we see in the Front Range and the North Park operating areas. Now, while there is an increase in water usage, the source of that water use is also changing as these projects are changing. While the 2025 directional projects that were approved still plan to use almost exclusively recycled water in the high 90 percentile, the horizontal projects plan to use none. The West Slope had previously been one of the operating areas that planned to use the most recycled water in the whole state. But as more projects plan to use none, that has brought down both the average West Slope recycled water usage as well as the statewide average to the lowest percentage yet, something that my colleague Dan spoke about in his presentation on the Front Range. Now, while this is not great news, there is a bright spot on the horizon. The new produced water rules have only recently gone into effect this year, 2026. And we anticipate a more positive trajectory in the future as more OGDPs are approved under these newest ECMC rules, requiring certain amounts of produced recycled water to be used. Now moving on to the Eastern Plains. This saw 5 projects approved containing 16 locations and 14 wells. 2 of those locations contained only tanks and no wells. Now, the Eastern Plains as a whole is a low density area, very rural, with large swaths of rangeland. And when you compare the Eastern Plains operating area to the previous 2 operating areas that you heard about tonight, there is significantly less oil and gas infrastructure out in the Eastern Plains compared to the Front Range or the West Slope. The dominant style in the Eastern Plains is for single well locations. These are what people think of as the traditional single well verticals. This is due to the conventional geology, and also because of this, hydraulic fracturing is not required for the wells to produce. Looking at the last 3 years, there has been an increase in deep helium projects in the Eastern Plains. These are projects that are targeting formations that are over 5,000 feet in depth, and these are proposed to produce both helium and hydrocarbons. So similar to what we've seen in the West Slope, as the operating style shifts, so do the impacts. In 2025, we saw an estimated increase in the Eastern Plains production hazardous air pollutant emissions, with nearly all of that related to the tanks being proposed on those locations. You can see this in the chart on the left is the increase in HAPs in the Eastern Plains, and in the chart on the right is where are those planned proposed production emissions coming from, with the orange for the Eastern Plains, 93% being tanks as the source for those hazardous air pollutants. Now, while the emissions are going up, again, proposed recycled water use is estimated to go down. The shift to the newer helium play, combined with a general lack of recycled water infrastructure, has led to a multi-year decline in the proposed amount of recycled water use in the Eastern Plains. This does contribute to the overall lower percentage of planned recycled water use statewide. Now, it's important to pause here and note, in terms of the scale of Eastern Plains water use, it is far, far, far less than what is the volumes used in the West Slope or in the Front Range. Again, this is because Eastern Plains wells are not hydraulically fractured. However, the trend of decreasing estimated percentage of recycled water use is notable. And again, like I just mentioned in the Western Slope discussion, we expect and anticipate that the newly enacted produced water rules will start to produce positive results on future projects within the Eastern Plains operating area. Now I'm going to turn this over to Pete, who's going to cover the last 3 operating areas tonight. Pete, take it away.
All right, thank you, Stephen. I'll be moving on to, the last 3 operating areas, starting with the Southeast Plains. So similar to the Eastern Plains, the Southeast Plains is a rural basin and does have single well location development, but is even more rural and less densely populated than the Eastern Plains and has even less oil and gas infrastructure built out across the operating area. This operating area has been dominated by shallow helium OGDPs, shallow in the sense that they're targeting formations less than 2,500 feet deep. So due to the shallow nature of these wells, they are some of the least impactful operations in all of Colorado, typically proposed using truck-mounted drilling rigs, more similar to water well rigs than big production rigs seen in other operating areas. In 2025, the Southeast Plains had 2 OGDPs approved, consisting of 9 proposed locations and 9 wells. So given how few OGDPs were received, there are not many takeaways in 2025, but one notable item is that the OGDPs continue to be cited entirely within DI communities, though not near people. So in terms of the siting within DI communities, the Southeast Plains continues to have some of the most locations cited within these DI communities for the past 2 years. However, due to the very rural nature of the operating area, that doesn't mean the locations are being sited near people. In fact, the Southeast Plains is the only operating area never to have an OGDP sited within 2,000 feet of a residential building unit. And in 2025, none of the locations were even within a mile of any RBUs. So bottom line, while the OGDPs may be proposed within DI communities, they're at least not being cited close to people within that DI community. For the North Park and Southwest Slope operating areas, both of these operating areas only had 1 project each in 2025, though they are quite different. North Park is located entirely within Jackson County in north central Colorado, and it's an isolated basin with little infrastructure. And the recent development there is hydraulically fractured horizontal wells similar to what's going on in the Front Range. The southwest slope is similar to the southeast plains in its rural nature. It contains the southern Ute Indian tribal lands, and the development has typically been coal bed methane with multiple laterals off a single vertical well. So with such little activity in these operating areas, it is difficult to draw many year-over-year conclusions, especially with North Park seeing its first project in 2024. With that said, one observation from 2025 is that though both basins are fairly rural, the OGDPs in each were sited within 2,000 feet of RBUs, meaning that the equipment on the locations, including produced water tanks, were also planned within 2,000 feet of the RBUs. This kind of bucks the trend we're seeing otherwise in different basins of fewer and fewer produced water tanks being sited near people. With that, on to wind, solar, and battery storage. With the passage of Senate Bill 24212 in 2024, the agency was charged with implementing several specific measures related to solar, wind, and battery storage projects. So in 2025, the agency completed those initial objectives, which specifically included hiring a renewable energy program coordinator, coordinating with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and the Colorado Energy Office to complete a clean energy code library and a siting assessment. And also developing a solar, wind, and battery storage website and technical assistance intake form. With that, specifically, the agency responded to 17 technical assistance requests in 2025, ranging from solar and battery storage project siting issues to local code and the development of regulations for renewable energy projects at the local level. As Sabrina noted earlier, those projects are regulated and permitted at the local level, not by the state. So with this work, some trends have emerged, and we've seen sort of a shifting landscape in terms of federal oversight and the technology and scale of newer projects that are being proposed. Demand for energy remains high overall, of course, and with Colorado's clean energy goals, there has been a push for more solar and battery storage projects in particular. Newer technologies like battery storage are being planned and proposed at a whole variety of different scales and uses. And many local governments just simply do not have the regulations and codes in place that adequately cover the range of potential project proposals and siting needs that are coming to them. We do expect that those areas to continue to be big areas of focus around the state and for our agency in 2026 and beyond. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Sabrina.
Thanks, Pete. I'm going to take just a little bit of a detour here. We did present information in the 2025 annual report about ECMC's marginal well plugging program, and I just wanted to take a couple extra moments to talk a little more in depth about this program. The marginal well plugging program was officially launched in 2025. The purpose of this program is to reduce the potential for methane emissions and other impacts through the remediation and plugging of old, low-producing wells that are at the end of their life cycle. Stay with me. How the program works is that operators apply to the program during our limited enrollment period, during which they indicate which wells they plan to plug and reclaim. Only certain wells are eligible for the program based on the well's productivity and other eligibility criteria. Once we receive all the applications, we conduct a thorough review of each well proposed for the program. Only those that meet all the required criteria are awarded funds. In order for the operator to actually receive the funds, they must plug the well and apply for reimbursement through the program. This ensures that operators are the ones doing all the work and paying the costs up front. They are reimbursed after we confirm that the well has been properly plugged. I want to highlight, because I feel like some of you might have some concerns about that. So I want to highlight a couple of things. The marginal well plugging program has two funding sources. The first is the Federal Methane Emissions Reduction Program, or MERP, and the second is the state's Enterprise Marginal Well Plugging Program. In the case of the state's enterprise funds, these are entirely supplied by industry fees. This means that no taxpayer dollars are going toward the program and the plugging of wells. Another thing I want to highlight is that this program is not, it doesn't allow sort of the big operators, the big, fancy, rich, wealthy, busy operators. They're not eligible for this program. This program aims to plug wells that are in or near disproportionately impacted communities, mitigate methane emissions, and to prevent wells from going into the orphan well program, because the operators are small operators, financially struggling. Mostly we're seeing sort of the mom and pop operators that have 2 or 3 or 5 wells across the state. So we're not talking about with Civitas now, it's what, SM. We're not talking about Kermagee, Oxy. We're talking about little mom and pop operators that haven't plugged those wells because of the expense to plug. They've just limped them along. So this is a really good program for that, and we are monitoring it very, very carefully. There's a lot of federal regulation through those MERP funds that we have to comply with. I'm proud to say that the first 2 wells in this program were plugged in November of 2025, and the program is the first round of awards are on track to plug 107 wells. We are working on reviewing the second round of applications right now, and it hasn't been released, but we are, I probably shouldn't say this, but we are looking at potentially awarding funds to plug another roughly 90 or so wells across the state. So stay tuned for that. We'll have more information on that. And if you'd like more information, the Marginal Well Plugging Program does have a public-facing dashboard on ECMC's website that shows the various data related to the grant awards, the number and location of wells plugged, and the amount of methane successfully mitigated through the plugging. For the MERP program, specifically, that's the federally funded wells, we have to take methane emission readings at the wellhead, and then we take them again after the well is plugged so that we can quantify how much methane is being conserved and not emitted. So I would invite you to explore this dashboard when you have time. We will make sure that it's linked and available to you. The annual report, we're wrapping up here. I know we're a little over time for the presentation. The annual report does give multiple recommendations to the commission. However, we're going to just focus on the ones that I think might have the most impact on policy and operations, and maybe the ones that this audience might be most interested in. First, we intend to continue making updates and improvements to the Form 2B in order to gather data more effectively, more meaningfully. We look forward to any recommendations that are coming from the various commissioner-led working groups or from the commission or from our stakeholders. It's an ongoing process. Next, we would like to work with our agency's technology and process experts to develop an automated process to track the wells and the locations that are listed on the Form 2B as slated for plugging and slated for closure when those closures are recognized as a beneficial impact as part of the OGDP project, their application. It will be important to track those well pluggings and location closures to ensure that operators are following through with their project commitments. Our third recommendation, and this is one that as I've been reading the Q&A coming in, or reading the questions coming in the Q&A tool in this meeting, I think some of you will appreciate this. Our third recommendation is for the commission to consider providing clarity around how much impact is too much. This is not staff recommending that the commission undertake a rulemaking. On the contrary, we think some clarification of our role in the director's recommendation, guidelines around the commission's expectations of operators, likely in the form of an internal SOP document and or external guidance document, will resolve some of these issues. That said, the commission has committed in a hearing, I think last week, that they would take up this question that staff has asked of them. So I know a lot of you in the chat or in the Q&A have asked, why are you still approving things when there's impacts? We're asking the same question. So we find some alignment with you, and it'll be really interesting to see what the commission, how the commission takes this question up. So stay tuned for that. And then finally, we intend to undertake research on how to assess whether a carbon capture sequestration or CCS or Class 6 project in a disproportionately impacted community will attain a no net negative impact. That is a statutory requirement. So this is probably going to require some stakeholdering, some interagency collaboration, as well as input from commissioners. We haven't directly undertaken that yet, so that is something that is definitely on our radar to move forward with. So last slide for us to conclude, I want to reiterate that ECMC's cumulative impacts rules are, not even arguably, they are the most protective oil and gas rules in the United States, probably in the world. The annual CI report gives us insight into the efficacy of those rules, more so than any other tool. It helps us determine, using real-world data, what is working to reduce adverse impacts and what needs to be improved. The agency's cumulative impacts program, including the annual report, doesn't deliver a single answer for all cases. I know a lot of you are very dissatisfied with ECMC, with our work, with this presentation, with everything we do. We intend for our cumulative impacts program and our report to evolve over time as we come to new understanding of the data, as industry and technology and operations continue to change around the state, and as each new project has its own unique circumstances that we need to consider. I also want to reiterate how important your input is to ECMC, and I'm guessing there's a few of you that will say, oh, you never listen to us. I hear you. We hear you. I promise we do. Whether you provide comments on a pending OGDP application or you give feedback on this annual report, which we are seeking, how can we make it more useful to you? How can we make information more accessible to you? We appreciate and we seek, and we will continue to seek your meaningful and thoughtful engagement in the work that we do. And this is not in my notes, but I personally, as the CIET manager, I'm offering right now on recording to you that if anyone on this call wants a more personal conversation, a one-on-one with me or a small group with me and my team, a small group discussion, please contact me directly. We are happy to set something up. Sometimes a smaller forum, even in person, which is my personal preference, can lead to going down the rabbit holes, more details, more meaningful conversation, more focus on the topics that are really bothering you, more ability to be vulnerable with each other. That is ultimately how we can build our relationship, right? ECMC is a big sort of ethereal entity, but we are really just a bunch of people doing our jobs, and we're very passionate and very dedicated to the work that we do on behalf of the state of Colorado. So if anyone here wants to connect with us in a small group or a one-on-one with me, please reach out. We want to find common ground with you because we can do more when we're working together to find workable solutions around oil and gas in particular. So I'll get off my soapbox. I'll save the rest of the time for Q&A. Thank you so much for your engagement. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really do appreciate your feedback, your input, your ideas, and please let me and my team know how we can provide additional information or how we can better engage in your community. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. And that's a good segue into our final poll, and we'll try to do this quickly so we can get to the Q&A. But we want to know how cumulative impacts can be more useful to you. So please take 30 to 45 seconds to answer these questions for us. And we appreciate you being here. While you're taking the poll, I'll just kind of queue up what will happen next. We're entering Q&A. We did receive several questions in advance of tonight's webinar. We're going to take 3 questions that were pre-submitted as our first questions, and then we'll do our best to answer as many of the questions that we received tonight before we run out of time. If we do run out, of time, we are committed to getting back to you and following up with everyone if we don't get to your questions tonight. So here's our poll results. Sabrina, do you want to make any comments on what you see here in real time real quick before we move on to Q&A? It seems pretty reasonable
I am
responses.
going to screenshot this so that I
Okay.
can keep it. This is really, really informative. It seems overwhelmingly people are wanting more charts comparing estimates to actuals, which I love because we haven't been able to do that over the last few years as much as we'd like to. As our program advances and we get more data, this is going to be a bigger thing on our radar. So that's really exciting for me.
Great. All right. Well, with that, we'll get to our Q&A section, and we'll go over just a little instructions here. Well, first we'll start with the questions that we got in advance, and then we'll explain to people how they can participate in the live QA.
So I might jump in. We've got a question here. How does ECMC use cumulative impacts information and permit review? And I've got sort of the written answer. Those of you that will refer back to this later on your own time will have at least the nuts and bolts of the answer. But what I'd like to share is that Rule 315A lays out the Commission's rules on what cumulative impact data is required on the Form 2B for every OGDP. And Rule 315B lays out the Commission's rules for this cumulative impacts analysis for every proposed location. Staff reviews these data together along with other parts of the OGDP application to determine if the operator has adequately identified the potential and the known sources of past, present, and future impacts, identified potential and known receptors, if they've identified the impacts, if the impacts estimated by the operator are reasonably expected based on the location of the proposed operations and the type of equipment planned for use, and if the operator adequately used the mitigation hierarchy. If staff finds that the operator's assessment is inadequate, we send the application back to them for revisions. We can also recommend additional best management practices or other mitigation measures directly to the operator. That's usually what we try to do. We try to get them to buy into it, or we can put it in the director's recommendation to the Commission. If necessary, we can recommend denial of the application, but I want to be really clear and transparent. That would be highly unusual for an application to get that far along in the permitting process without us stopping it for additional discussion with the operator. We generally only let approvable applications through to the Commission for hearing. So for those asking, why are you still permitting? Why are you still approving OGDPs, even though there's impacts? Those OGDPs meet ECMC rules. They meet our mission. You might not like them. In some cases, staff doesn't like them, but if they legally meet and fulfill and demonstrate compliance with ECMC's rules, we push it through to the commissioners to make that sort of moral or ethical decision. And again, that's a topic that the commission is going to take up here, hopefully sometime this summer. I also want to brag for a moment by saying that this team, the Cumulative Impacts team, has a combined 112 years of experience in environmental protection and related disciplines. I am confident that our evaluation and assessment of cumulative impacts, whether it's on an OGDP or a comprehensive area plan, or over all of the multiple years of data gathered and interpreted in the annual report, is carefully, thoughtfully, and collaboratively vetted with us, with other subject matter experts across ECMC and other agencies such as CPW and APCD. Our cumulative impacts program will continue to evolve, and we will continue to fine-tune our work. But ECMC's rules are the strictest in the nation for cumulative impacts, specifically for oil and gas. No other state has such a robust program for avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating impacts related to oil and gas.
Thanks, Sabrina. I'm going to move us along. We do need to kind of pick it up a little bit if we're going to get to as many questions as possible. So here's the next one. How is annual report used by staff, local governments, and other state agencies?
So the annual report is meant to provide a snapshot view of all the OGDP applications approved by the Commission each calendar year. From this, we gain insight into the impacts that may be occurring in the future as those approved permits are acted upon by operators. For ECMC staff, the report helps us understand changes in trends, whether those are changes in anticipated impacts, changes in operational practices, changes in common technology being deployed, or changes based on geographic and basinal geological differences. Studying these trends and the individual data that produce them, including unusual outliers, helps us understand what BMPs, what rules, what policies are effective in avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating adverse impacts so that we can seek regulatory improvements where we identify gaps. It helps us make recommendations to the Commission so they are able to further set regulatory priorities based on what we see in the report. Local governments are also able to use the report to learn about development in their own counties and municipalities. This enables the local governments to have a clearer picture of future impacts as well as public interest generated through the report. And then other state agencies like CPW and APCD rely on the report to inform them how ECMC's rules are helping their own missions across the state. For example, the Form 2B emissions estimates we receive from operators in the Form 2B help APCD understand how industry is estimating their emissions, which then are reported later in APCD's on-GARE system. By comparing the 2B emissions estimates with the on-GARE actuals, both ECMC and APCD get a better understanding about how well various emission calculations and emission factors are being made and how effective emission control devices are.
Thanks, Sabrina. Now our final question that was submitted in advance. For someone participating tonight who wants their input to matter in a future permit decision, what should they do differently or more specifically?
I love this one, and this one's not totally in alignment with the presentation tonight, but I wanted to include this because your input does matter. And I know that you hear that from commissioners and you hear that all the time. And I know you think that it doesn't, but it does. The key though is make your input specific about a rule, specific about how you see an operator not complying with the rule. Make your feedback specific about, hey, there's a new technology I think you should look at because it does way better than some other technology. Be specific. And I don't mean to minimize anyone's lived experience. That type of feedback is important, absolutely critically important as well. But the commission can only take action on the things in the commission's jurisdiction and authority. And so if you give us feedback that says, this operator doesn't seem to be complying with this rule, and here's how, or this application doesn't seem to be fulfilling or demonstrating compliance with Rule 315B2G, then we can look at that more closely. That is the level of specificity and meaningful contribution and commentary that most affects change here at ECMC. So there is a resource, CDPHE has a resource, 10 tips for making effective public comments. Review that and give us as specific as input as you can, because we do want it. We absolutely want it.
Thanks, Sabrina. And we did put that link in the chat. And now I'll move just to remind everyone, we did get a lot of questions using the Q&A feature. So thank you. We're collating that. We're going to do the best we can with the few minutes we have. You also now in the Q&A, you can use the raise your hand feature, and we can call on you if you want to ask. But just to keep us moving, I'm going to jump right in to the question here that we had, and it was around well plugging. And if well plugging is a requirement, why is it included as a positive outcome in the CI report if it's something that they have to do anyway?
I'm going to take this question, and that's an excellent question. It might not be totally obvious, and you're right. Well plugging is a requirement, and if an operator doesn't plug their well at the end of life, then they're in violation and will likely go to enforcement. As by offering operators to plug other wells as part of an OGDP application as a beneficial impact, it usually results in them plugging the well sooner rather than later. If they know that they can leverage an old well and say, hey, commission, we want this OGDP approved, and we're going to plug these 5 old 20-year-old wells that are low producing, and they're all in a DI community, does that give us sort of any leverage? It does. It does, because if they didn't plug those wells as part of the OGDP, those wells might continue to produce at a very minimal rate and cause emissions or other issues for many, many, many years. So it is a beneficial impact for an operator to commit to plugging those wells sooner rather than later. I also want to caveat that by saying, and this sort of relates to the marginal well plugging program and our orphan well program, if operators plug those wells when they can, while they're still largely functioning responsible operators, then there's less likelihood that that well is going to fall into the orphan well program. So there is a couple layers of beneficial impact there.
Thank you, Sabrina. We had a question to see if we could answer if we have a recent example of the commission rejecting a permit because of cumulative impacts data. Dan, do you want to take this one?
Sure, I can take that. Yes, this year the commission did deny a permit that was presented to them at the commission hearing. And when they were doing their deliberations, it became clear that a lot of their reason for denying that permit was because of what they read in the cumulative impact analysis that was part of that application. They found that there was a preponderance of adverse cumulative impacts that would result from approving that permit, and so they denied it.
Thank you, Dan. Just to remind you, we just have a couple minutes. If you wanted to raise your hand, if not, let me look and scan our questions. Some of the questions were answered during the presentation. We know one that, again, maybe Dan, if you wanted to just reiterate the ways that we work with the Air Pollution Control Division, even though we don't regulate air, we do work very closely with them, and maybe you can speak to that partnership.
Sure, absolutely. So from the very beginning of the form development for the 2B, we designed the emissions section of the Form 2B to align with the data that APCD was collecting from operators, so that we could eventually get to this point of a apples to apples comparison with the estimated emissions compared with APCD's actual emissions. We're continuing to work with them to improve that comparison. This was the first year that we actually presented a comparison of those data sets in the report. Yeah, that work is ongoing.
Thank you, Dan. We are running out of time. I do want to remind everyone the QR code on this slide, you can scan that and you can fill out the feedback form. You can also include questions to us if we did not get to your question this evening. I'll give you a moment to scan that, and then I'm going to close tonight's webinar. We really do appreciate you hanging with us for the entire time. Okay, so just in closing, here again is the feedback form and the QR code. We appreciate you being here. We do have some upcoming meetings that we will be advertising. Hopefully you subscribe to our newsletter. But July 24th, first you can hear from our hearings group, and then August we'll have the environmental team, and then in September we're going to be doing kind of a podcast style general update on our outreach and community relations. Again, here's all the ways you can stay in touch with us. Again, if you want to stay up to speed, please follow Carbon Copy and on social. With that, we will be providing additional resources in this deck, including how to get to some of the documents that we shared with you tonight. And that will be in the slide deck and the recording of this. So we appreciate everyone joining us tonight. And with that, I will say good evening and thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.